Julian Reeves had always believed that money could insulate him from chaos. His skyscraper penthouse high above Manhattan's heartbeat was supposed to be the one place untouched by surprises. But that illusion shattered the moment he stepped into his guest suite that quiet afternoon. The weight of the boardroom still clung to him like a second skin. Contracts that blurred into arguments, investors hungry for control, and decisions that drained the soul. He had arrived early, hoping to escape the demands of power and reclaim a moment of stillness. But instead of peace, his eyes were assaulted by an image so unexpected, his breath caught mid-chest. The golden glow of the setting sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble tiles and bathing the room in an amber hush. And there, standing barefoot on the glassy floor, was a woman, young, slender, utterly unaware of his presence. Her back, graceful and strong, was arched ever so slightly as she reached upward, a white cloth in her hand, making small circular motions on the glass. Her long golden hair spilled over her shoulder like liquid sunlight, and she was completely, irrevocably naked. No uniform, no awareness, just humming softly to herself with the careless innocence of someone utterly alone. Julian froze, every muscle tensing in sheer panic, not from desire but disbelief. His brain scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this a hallucination born of exhaustion? A prank? An intruder? He had hired a temporary cleaning agency through his assistant. Was this their idea of professional? As he instinctively stepped back, his Italian leather shoe clipped the edge of a bucket that had been tucked by the door, sending it tumbling forward with a clang that echoed through the room like a bomb. The noise shattered the silence, and the girl whirled around in alarm, her expression flipping from serenity to shock in an instant. Their eyes locked. Hers, wide, oceanic blue, full of horror and vulnerability, met his icy ones, equally stunned. For the first time in a long time, Julian Reeves, the man who silenced rooms with a glance, was utterly speechless. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words disintegrated on his tongue, and instead he lifted his hands instinctively, as if to prove he meant no harm. She gasped, clutched for the nearest towel, a blush rising violently across her cheeks as she pressed it to her chest with trembling hands. Julian's face flushed scarlet, a rare sight for a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching. I'm sorry. I thought this room was empty, he stammered, voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. The girl didn't speak, just stared at him in frozen disbelief, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the towel, the delicate line of her collarbone visibly trembling. The awkwardness hung in the air like dense fog, thick with embarrassment and confusion. Julian spun on his heel and practically fled the room, pulling the door shut behind him with more force than necessary, his heart thudding wildly against his ribs. Leaning back against the wall in the hallway, he raked a hand through his tousled black hair, trying to gather the shattered pieces of his composure. What just happened? Who was she? Why hadn't anyone told him someone was cleaning today? Was she even supposed to be there? Questions stormed through his mind like lightning, colliding with the lingering image of her. Sunlit skin, unguarded innocence. The way her blue eyes had searched his face not with seduction, but with confusion and fear. He felt like a trespasser, not just in that room, but in a moment that wasn't his to witness. And yet something about her, something unspoken and raw, had struck a chord inside him, like an old melody long forgotten. He had seen countless beautiful women in his lifetime, been pursued for his wealth, charm, and status. But this girl was different. She hadn't tried to impress. She hadn't even known she was being seen. She existed in that room with unfiltered vulnerability, and it disarmed him more than any strategic threat ever had. As he walked away, still shaken, Julian had no idea that this accidental encounter would become the turning point of his life, that the girl behind that towel would unravel his walls, expose his wounds, and challenge everything he believed about love, honesty, and second chances. Julian barely slept that night, his mind swirling with thoughts of the girl he had so awkwardly walked in on. Her startled blue eyes haunted him far more than the accident itself, not because of what he saw, but because of how unguarded she had been in that moment, like a deer caught in headlights, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. The next morning, still feeling an odd twist of remorse in his gut, he bypassed his assistant and went straight to the building's maintenance office, demanding to know who the girl was. The staff shuffled uneasily, flipping through schedules, until finally someone mentioned that she wasn't part of the regular crew, that she was an independent cleaner, hired occasionally through an outside service under the name Claire Maddox. The name settled into Julian's memory like a stone sinking in water. Claire. It didn't sound glamorous or mysterious. It sounded real. Somehow that made it harder to forget. He stared down at the phone number the manager hesitantly provided, feeling ridiculous for caring so much about fixing something so minor, yet unable to walk away from it. When he called, she didn't pick up. Not once. Not the first day, not the second. By the third, he left a message, awkward and clipped, offering to compensate her double for the embarrassment. An apology in the form of a one-time cleaning gig, no strings, no expectations. He told himself it was about closure, restoring professionalism, doing the right thing. But the truth was more tangled. He wanted to see her again. She didn't respond until the fifth day, with a text that simply read, "Fine. 1 hour. That's it." When she finally arrived, her posture was different, rigid, cautious, and sharp-edged, like someone prepared to bolt at the first wrong word. Gone was the serene girl he'd seen by the window. In her place stood a young woman in jeans and a faded hoodie, hair tied up, chin tilted defiantly, daring him to say something inappropriate. Julian didn't. Instead, he greeted her respectfully, offering her a bottled water and stepping back to give her space. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. More like two people standing on a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. She moved through the room with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact, barely breathing. He stood nearby, unsure what to say, until finally he offered a nervous, "Look, I never meant to invade your privacy. It was an accident, an embarrassing one, for both of us." Claire didn't look up, but her mouth twitched just slightly. "You don't say," she muttered under her breath, and though the sarcasm was biting, there was something soft buried beneath it. A pause stretched between them, and then she added quieter this time, "You could have just forgotten it happened. Most rich guys would have." Julian exhaled, sitting on the arm of his leather couch, watching her wipe a table with more intensity than necessary. "I guess I'm not like most rich guys." That made her glance at him for the first time. Just a flicker, but enough for him to see it, that glint in her eyes that wasn't just guardedness. It was pain. Deep-rooted, familiar pain. She looked away quickly, but not before he caught it, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about how beautiful she was or how awkward their first meeting had been. He was thinking about how someone so young could carry eyes that tired. The room felt heavier now, filled with more than dust and discomfort. Claire moved to the kitchen, but her steps had slowed, her breath more deliberate, as if she knew he was reading between the lines she never said aloud. "You don't have to feel bad," she said eventually, her back still to him. "Stuff like that happens. People mess up. It's just life." Julian didn't respond right away. He watched her reach for a cloth, wring it out too tightly, and finally he said, "That may be true, but not everyone owns it." Another pause, another flicker of something in her posture. She turned around slowly, her golden hair catching the sunlight just right, giving her a faint glow even under the fluorescent lights. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, and this time her eyes met his with less hostility, more confusion. Julian offered a half smile, not the smug corporate kind, but a smaller, sadder one that felt truer. "Neither are you." For a moment, they stood there, simply looking. Two people from separate worlds, unexpectedly connected by an awkward accident neither could have scripted. And though no one said it aloud, something shifted between them. An unspoken understanding, the kind that forms not from shared joy, but from quietly recognizing the ache in someone else's silence. Claire picked up her bucket and moved toward the door, and Julian stood to walk her out, not out of politeness, but because he didn't want her to leave without knowing she'd been seen, not as a mistake, but as a person. She hesitated at the threshold, then looked back, one brow raised. "This isn't going to be a thing, right?" she asked, her voice dry but less sharp. Julian shook his head, offering a calm nod. Number? Unless you want it to be. Her eyes searched his face for signs of a joke, but found none. With a final, unreadable look, Claire turned and walked down the hallway, her figure disappearing into the elevator's closing doors, but her presence lingering in Julian's chest like a stubborn whisper he couldn't shake. A name that now meant more than just an apology. It meant beginning. After Claire disappeared behind the elevator doors, Julian remained standing at the threshold of his penthouse, as if part of him had left with her, and for the rest of the evening, the silence in his lavish home felt more suffocating than serene. The marble floors gleamed, the skyline sparkled beyond the windows, and yet everything felt cold, lifeless, performative, like a museum of success curated to distract from everything he had buried. Days passed, and though their conversations were brief, Claire began returning once a week, never confirming she would, never announcing her arrival, just showing up like clockwork, quietly slipping into his world with the sound of a mop bucket and that same guarded stare. Julian, though never one to linger around help, found himself timing his meetings to end early, just to catch her at the tail end of her shift. One evening, the sky outside darkened with heavy rain, and Claire remained longer than usual, drying counters and folding towels with meticulous slowness. Julian, watching from the kitchen island, finally broke the silence, offering her coffee, not from obligation, but with a strange nervousness in his voice he wasn't used to. She hesitated, then nodded, perching at the edge of his leather bar stool like a bird ready to flee at the first wrong word. For a while they spoke of meaningless things, traffic, how overpriced Manhattan parking was, the best donut in the city, until the conversation stalled, hanging on a fragile thread. And then quietly Julian said, "You ever trusted someone so completely that when they turned on you, it broke something you didn't even know could break?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it reached Claire with a clarity that pulled the air from her lungs. She didn't speak, just watched him, his jaw tight, eyes distant, as he stared into his untouched mug like it held ghosts. "Her name was Isla," he said after a beat. "We were together since high school. My best friend Damien, he was like a brother. They both were. We grew up together, laughed, built dreams. And one day I came home early from a trip and found them, together, in my house, my bed." His voice didn't crack, but the silence that followed did. Claire didn't gasp or offer empty sympathy. She simply sat there listening, her eyes softening with a kind of understanding that came from her own unspoken history. Julian leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin, still not looking at her. "I built walls after that, not out of spite, but survival. If the two people you trusted most can break you, who won't?" Claire blinked slowly, her fingers tightening around her cup, the weight of his pain settling in her chest like a mirror to her own. But she said nothing of her past, not yet. "That's why you're alone," she said softly, not as a question, but a conclusion, and he met her gaze with a flicker of something raw. Vulnerability. "It's safer," he replied, "but it's also lonelier than I ever imagined." That admission hung in the air, unguarded and real, and something between them shifted in that moment. Not romantic yet, but intimate in a way that neither comfort nor closeness could explain. Claire wanted to tell him everything right then, to say that she understood betrayal, that she knew what it felt like to be reduced to a shadow of yourself after someone you trusted burned you from the inside. But fear gripped her tongue, because if she told him who she really was, the mask she wore would collapse, and whatever strange trust was forming would vanish. Julian, though perceptive, didn't press. He noticed the flicker in her eyes, the hesitation, the way her breath caught before her walls slid back up. But he let it be. His curiosity was growing, no doubt, but he respected silence because he knew what it meant to hold a secret like armor. Instead, he told her more about his world, not the glossy business empire or the magazine covers, but the loneliness of being admired by strangers and distrusted by those who mattered, of being loved for what he could give rather than who he was. And Claire unexpectedly found herself offering tiny pieces in return, Memories of sleepless nights, a childhood spent watching the world fall apart around her. Vague allusions to a past that still clung to her like ash. The rain outside became a lullaby as their conversation stretched into hours. Two broken souls finding unexpected warmth in the quiet honesty of a shared room. No declarations were made, no lines were crossed, but when she stood to leave, Julian walked her to the door again. Not out of habit, but because watching her leave now stirred something uncomfortable inside him. "Thanks for the coffee," she said, almost smiling. "Thanks for listening," he replied. She nodded once, turned, and this time, when the elevator closed, Julian found himself already hoping she'd return. Not because he needed his floors cleaned, but because Claire Maddox was slowly becoming the only part of his day that didn't feel hollow. And though neither of them could admit it yet, something fragile and undeniable had begun to take root in the silence between them. That evening, the city sky split open with rolling thunder, sheets of rain slamming against glass like 1,000 restless hands trying to claw their way inside. And Julian found himself staring at the storm from his floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering if Claire would cancel, but she didn't. She arrived, soaked to the bone, her hoodie clinging to her frame, and golden hair plastered to her cheeks, water dripping from her fingertips as she stepped just inside the door, cheeks flushed and breath short, murmuring apologies for not calling ahead. Julian moved quickly, offering her a towel and ushering her inside, shutting the door on the storm's wrath and the chill that clung to her skin. "You're not going back out in that," he said firmly, voice low but resolute. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the fatigue in her eyes betrayed her. With quiet resignation, she nodded, and he brought her one of his oversized sweaters and a pair of drawstring pants, motioning toward the guest bathroom. Moments later, she emerged wrapped in warmth that dwarfed her frame, her damp hair tied into a low bun, eyes softer now as she accepted the hot tea he handed her. He turned on the fireplace, the flames dancing like whispers between them, and let soft jazz hum in the background, just enough to fill the silence. They sat on the couch, not too close but close enough, the kind of distance that hinted at unspoken hesitations. Claire cradled the mug between both hands, her eyes locked on the fire, and after a long pause she said, "I wasn't always cleaning apartments, you know." Her voice was steady, but Julian could hear the tightness behind it. He didn't interrupt. She continued, "My mom got sick 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She didn't tell anyone until it was stage 4. By then, insurance wouldn't cover most of it. I dropped out of New York University, sold her car, spent everything we had trying to buy more time." Her throat worked hard against emotion, but her tone didn't falter. "She died in my arms on a Tuesday, just slipped away while I was reading her favorite poem." Julian didn't speak, but his chest tightened, the pain in her voice slicing through the armor he wore like designer suits. Claire let out a small, humorless laugh. "And now I scrub marble floors for men in towers who don't even see me. Funny how life turns out, isn't it?" Her gaze drifted to him then, as if daring him to pity her, to flinch, but he didn't. He simply looked back, his eyes holding not judgment, but something rare: respect. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with weight, the kind that only truth can bring. Julian reached forward, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing her temple with care he hadn't known he possessed. Her breath hitched, the contact electric, fragile. Their eyes locked, the air humming with something unspoken but undeniably present. The distance between them seemed to disappear for one suspended moment, two souls orbiting closer than either had intended. But before it could become more, Claire blinked and turned her face away, her hands tightening around the mug like a shield. "I shouldn't have told you all that," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's not your burden to carry." Julian's response was quiet but unwavering. "You're not a burden, Claire." She shook her head, the walls rebuilding brick by brick. "You don't know everything." He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to press, to unravel the tangled web she kept wrapped so tightly around herself, but something told him not to. Not yet. She wasn't ready, and forcing it might shatter what little trust she had let him hold. So instead, he poured her another glass of wine and asked about her favorite books. She smiled faintly, grateful for the lifeline back to normalcy. and began talking about classic literature, quoting lines with a fluency that betrayed her intelligence and hinted at a version of herself she no longer allowed the world to see. Julian listened, not just with ears but with intention, his fascination growing not from her beauty, but from the depth of who she was beneath the surface. As the storm raged outside, the warmth in the room built slowly, not from heat or alcohol, but from the way pain met understanding and didn't recoil. Hours slipped by, and when the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Claire stood reluctantly, thanking him for the clothes and the quiet, both of which she hadn't known she needed. Julian walked her to the door again, but this time, as she turned to leave, he reached for her hand. Not gripping, not pulling, just touching her fingers gently, like a promise that didn't need words. She looked down at their hands, then up into his eyes, something flickering there, a mix of fear, hope, and something she wasn't ready to name. "Good night, Julian," she said softly. And this time, when the elevator doors closed, the silence left behind wasn't lonely. It was heavy with the weight of a story that had only just begun to unfold. The morning after the storm, the air between Julian and Claire was different. Not tense, not awkward, but laced with something fragile neither of them dared to name. And when Julian invited her to a charity art gallery opening later that week, his voice carried a softness that didn't demand, just offered. Claire hesitated, unsure if she belonged in his world beyond a mop and a bucket. But something in his eyes, a quiet pleading she hadn't seen before, nudged her to say yes. When the night arrived, she stepped out of the car dressed in a simple satin blue gown Julian had gifted her, its elegance clinging to her like moonlight. For a moment, the bustling city paused around her, and even Julian, tailored in black with a loosened tie, found himself breathless. The gallery was buzzing with curated laughter and champagne flutes, people swirling in designer labels and feigned interest in abstract brushstrokes. But all Julian could see was her, standing beside him, unsure of her place, but radiating a quiet grace that made even the most polished socialites glance twice. He introduced her without hesitation as someone important, not needing to define what that meant, just knowing it was true. Claire blushed, murmured polite greetings, and tried to keep her hands from shaking as she clutched her glass of white wine. Every time she looked at Julian, she saw him watching her, not with ownership or pride, but with a kind of awe that made her chest tighten. They moved through the crowd like two magnets slightly out of sync, brushing fingers, exchanging glances, their energy a low hum beneath the violin playing in the corner. When the night waned and they slipped out under a sky dusted with stars, Julian offered to walk her home, and for once, she didn't object. The air was cool, her heels clicked softly against the pavement, and their conversation drifted from art to memories to little things, like how she used to draw on napkins during diner shifts, or how he'd once built a cardboard skyscraper as a child just to pretend he owned Manhattan. As they reached her building, the sidewalk became their private universe, silent but alive with everything unsaid. Julian turned to her slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she tilted her chin upward, eyes flickering between his lips and his gaze, her breath catching like a match waiting to be lit. Their faces inched closer, hearts pounding louder than the traffic behind them, and the world held its breath for 1 second, just one, before Claire pulled back, her hand resting gently on his chest. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered, her voice trembling, eyes clouded with something deeper than fear. Shame. Julian's face fell, not in anger, but in ache, as if something vital had slipped through his fingers. She stepped away slowly, offered a sad smile, then turned and disappeared through the front door of her building, leaving him standing there beneath the street lamp, hands in his pockets, heart half open and unanswered. The next morning he called her. Then again. By noon, her number was disconnected. Her name was no longer listed in the building's guest log. The service she cleaned through had no idea where she'd gone. She had erased herself like chalk from a sidewalk, leaving no trace except the hollow space in Julian's chest where her presence used to rest. He stared out at the city that night, its lights blinking like lies, and for the first time in years, he felt not just alone, but lost. The days bled into weeks, and yet Claire's absence hung around Julian like a storm cloud that refused to break. He went through his meetings on autopilot, nodded through investor calls, signed contracts with perfect signatures but an absent mind, while her name repeated in his head like a song stuck on a loop. He tried everything, called every number in his network, hired discreet investigators, even questioned the cleaning service again, but she had vanished like a ghost who never wanted to be remembered. It wasn't until a mundane object, a crumpled receipt left in a drawer she once tidied, caught his eye that something shifted. It was from an independent bookstore in a quiet borough uptown, dated the day before she disappeared. Gripping it like a thread of hope, Julian drove out that same afternoon, his heart a strange mixture of dread and yearning. The bookstore owner remembered her instantly. Kind girl, always asks for the classic, he said, then added that she often walked across the street to help at a small community library. Julian followed the directions, and as he stepped inside the sunlit, paper-scented space, the air caught in his lungs. There she was, Claire, kneeling between rows of books, reading softly to three children curled beside her like kittens, her hair tied back loosely, wearing a cardigan 2 sizes too big, and an expression so full of warmth it shattered him. She looked nothing like the woman who once dazzled beside him at the gallery, and everything like someone who had finally found peace. For a moment, he simply watched, frozen in the threshold of a truth he wasn't prepared for. When their eyes met, Claire's smile faltered, her face draining of color. She stood slowly, gently patting a child's shoulder, then walked toward him like someone approaching an earthquake. Julian, she breathed, but he didn't speak. His gaze scanned her, not for answers, but for pieces of the puzzle she never gave him. You found me. You ran, he replied softly. I had to. Her voice cracked, and then finally she told him everything. The real reason behind her silence, the burden she'd carried for years. Her father, once a respected senator, had been caught in a massive corruption scandal that made national headlines. Money laundering, bribery, lies. Their family name became poison overnight. Friends vanished. Reporters camped outside. Claire was 17 when it happened. She lost college scholarships, her privacy, and eventually her mother, who couldn't bear the shame. Claire changed her name, abandoned everything familiar, and began building a new identity, brick by quiet brick, cleaning floors, shelving books, and staying invisible to protect herself from the world's cruelty. I didn't lie to you, she whispered, tears rimming her eyes. I just didn't want to be hated for someone else's sins. I thought if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently. Julian's throat tightened, his heart fracturing with every word she spoke. Not out of disappointment, but for all she had endured in silence. Slowly, without a word, he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never wanted to let go. She stiffened, then melted into him, burying her face into his chest as the weight she'd carried alone finally found a resting place. Claire, he murmured into her hair, you were the most honest person I ever met, even in silence. No headlines, no legacy, no name could change what he felt in that moment. For him, she was never a scandal or a secret. She was the truth he'd been searching for all along. The days after their reunion passed like a dream neither of them dared to wake from. Quiet moments, shared coffee, long walks through Claire's tucked-away part of the city where no one knew his last name or cared how many zeros sat in his account. Julian didn't rush her. He simply showed up every day, bringing her favorite muffins, carrying boxes of donated books into the library, sitting in on story time with the kids she loved like family, until one golden afternoon, with sunlight spilling between library windows, he reached across the table and gently took her hand. Move in with me, he said, the words tender but certain. Claire blinked, her breath catching, not because it was sudden, but because it was real. Not as my staff, he added before she could speak, not as someone who owes me anything, but as someone I want beside me in the morning, in the dark, in every quiet space life gives us. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Old fears crawled up her spine, fears of being too much or not enough, of giving her heart only to lose herself again. But before she could fall back into the silence of doubt, Julian's voice cut through. I walked in on you once by mistake, but I'm walking into your life now, on purpose. His words wrapped around her like a vow, and in that moment, something cracked open inside her. She leaned forward, cupped his face, and kissed him, not shyly, not nervously, but like someone choosing to stay. From that day on, they built something slow and beautiful. Movie nights curled under blankets, dinners cooked terribly but laughed through, arguments softened by apologies that came with meaning, and touch that never demanded but always promised safety. Of course, the world noticed. Headlines flared like wildfire. Billionaire falls for former maid. Julian Reeves in the Cinderella nobody saw coming. But Claire didn't crumble under the spotlight this time. She stood beside him at galas and press conferences, chin high, not because she wanted fame, but because she refused to shrink again. The strength in her eyes told the world, she chose this, and she belonged.